I was 32 the summer I decided to take a solo camping trip through north-central Idaho. I'd been living in Spokane for a few years, working a remote job in GIS mapping, and I'd gotten sick of staring at screens. I used to camp a lot in my 20s but hadn't been out much the past couple years. Something in me needed space, silence, and trees again. I missed the feeling of being out in the middle of nowhere, relying on myself, tuning out from everything. I spent 2 weeks planning. Not some huge expedition, just a few nights deep in a section of Clearwater National Forest I'd never been to. I picked a stretch near a place called Miller Ridge, mostly because it was off the beaten path and didn't get much foot traffic. I studied topo maps, made a basic itinerary, packed dehydrated meals, and loaded up my Tacoma with my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, emergency kit, a Ruger LCP I kept in the glove box, and all the usual stuff. I told my sister in Boise roughly where I'd be, just in case. Cell service would be dead out there. I left Spokane early on a Wednesday in late July. The heat hadn't peaked yet, and mornings were still cool. I hit Lolo Pass by noon, then turned onto a gravel forest road that climbed slowly into dense pine-covered hills. It took almost an hour on that washboard road before I reached the spot I'd marked on the map. There was no formal trail, just a narrow logging road from the 80s that had been swallowed by time. I parked in a clearing, threw on my pack, locked up the truck, and started walking. The first 2 hours in were peaceful. Everything was quiet except the wind moving through the trees and my boots crunching the ground. The forest there is thick but not suffocating. Light filters in through tall lodgepole pines, and the underbrush isn't too wild. I followed the ridge south for a couple miles until I came to a sloped flat above a dry creek bed. It was perfect. I dropped my pack, scouted the area, and set up my tent on a patch of ground mostly free of roots and rocks. That first night was uneventful. I boiled some water on my jet boil, had a packet of chili mac, drank from my canteen, and sat watching the stars come out. No fire, conditions were dry, and I wasn't about to risk a spark. I crawled into my tent around 10, zipped up, and lay listening to the breeze. The wind came in light gusts, fluttering the tent walls. Somewhere off in the distance, an owl called once. Otherwise, it was quiet. The second day, I explored a bit. Hiked a few ridges, saw some deer sign and a single black bear print along the edge of the creek bed, but nothing fresh. I followed that creek down for a bit, found a good spot to refill my water filter, then looped back up to camp. Around midday, clouds moved in and cooled the air a bit, which was welcome. I spent the afternoon resting and reading a book I'd packed. By evening, the sky cleared, and I had another quiet night. But it was the third day that things started to feel off. I'd gone out hiking early that morning, planning to check out a saddle between 2 ridges that I'd seen on the map. I left camp around 7, followed a faint game trail down through the pines, and came up the other side toward the ridge. It was steeper than I'd expected, and the climb took longer. By the time I made it to the top, it was almost noon. That's when I noticed the movement. First, I thought it was just a deer, a shape, maybe 50 yards away through the trees, ducking behind a cluster of brush. But when I moved forward, slowly trying to catch a better look, I saw what I now know for sure was a man. Tall, lean build, probably mid-30s or older. He was wearing dark clothes, almost like work coveralls, and had something slung across his back. He moved quick, like he didn't want to be seen. 1 second he was there, and then he slipped behind the trees and was gone. That stopped me cold. I was a few miles from the road, in the middle of nowhere, and I hadn't seen a single person since I left the truck. My heart started to pound. I stood still, listening, but I didn't hear footsteps or voices or anything else. After a minute, I slowly backed away and returned to camp from a different direction, staying low and quiet just in case. By the time I got back, I was sweating, even though the air had cooled. I packed up my more valuable gear and stashed it in my pack, just in case I had to leave quickly. I didn't have any cell signal, of course, so I couldn't call anyone. I wasn't in panic mode, but I felt exposed, vulnerable. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking about the guy. There's always the possibility it was another hiker or hunter, but something about the way he moved, the way he ducked out of sight. Fast, deliberate, it didn't sit right. It wasn't the kind of body language you expect from someone casually out hiking. I didn't make dinner that night. I didn't want the smell hanging in the air. I just stayed in my tent with the bear spray and my pistol within reach. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to what I thought was a branch snapping. It was close, maybe 30 feet from the tent. I held my breath and listened hard. There was no wind, no animal sounds, just dead silence. Then another soft sound, like a boot shifting against dirt. I didn't move. I just lay there frozen for what felt like forever, my ears straining. Eventually, whatever it was seemed to move away. The crunching sounds faded. I waited another hour before I even considered dozing off. The next morning, I packed everything up. I wanted out. I didn't know who was out there, but I didn't want to stick around long enough to find out. I started hiking back toward the truck, making good time, constantly checking over my shoulder. Every snapped twig or rustling leaf made me flinch. The air felt thick, like something was watching me. When I finally got back to the clearing where I'd parked, I froze. The truck had been messed with. Not destroyed, not broken into, just disturbed in ways that made my skin crawl. The driver's side mirror had been folded in. A streak of mud was smeared across the windshield. My spare gas can was on the ground, empty. It was full when I left. The cap was unscrewed and sitting 5 feet away. I unlocked the door and climbed in, half expecting someone to jump out of the woods. Nothing happened. I turned the key. The engine started, but it sputtered. I checked the gas gauge. The tank was half full, but I'd left it nearly full. Someone had siphoned my gas. I didn't wait around to investigate. I got the hell out of there, bouncing over that gravel road, white-knuckling the wheel. I didn't relax until I was 30 miles away, back in cell range, with the highway stretching ahead of me. That night, I stayed at a cheap motel in Missoula, locked the door, didn't sleep. I called the sheriff's office in the area the next day and reported what happened. They didn't say much, took down the information, told me they'd send someone to check the area when they had a unit free. That was it. No follow-up. Nothing ever came of it. A couple weeks later, I was browsing some old camping forums, mostly just to get it out of my system, and I came across a thread from the previous summer. Someone had posted about a weird guy hanging around trailheads near the same area, stealing gear, following people. Never caught, never identified. One poster said their friend had a tire slashed out there. Another said they thought they were being watched for 2 nights straight. All I could think was, asterisk, yeah, that tracks. Asterisk. I haven't camped alone since then. I still go out sometimes, mostly with friends, usually to spots that are more trafficked. I still love the woods, still feel drawn to the quiet. But something in me changed out there near Miller Ridge. It wasn't a ghost story. There was no cryptid, no monster. Just a man, maybe more than one, who didn't want to be seen. A man who'd siphon your gas, creep up to your tent, and disappear without a sound. Someone who lives in that margin of wilderness, right on the edge of where people go and where they don't. And the thing that stuck with me the most wasn't the fear or even the danger, it was the silence. How the forest just swallowed everything. How even after I got back, after I told people, there was no resolution, no arrest, no explanation, just me, the trees, and someone I hope I never see again. My name's Dylan, and this happened in 2017 when I was 26 years old. I was living out of my car at the time, doing long solo trips across the Midwest and the South. I'd been on the road for almost 3 months, just trying to disconnect from everything after quitting my job in Kansas City. I wasn't really sure what I was looking for. I'd sleep at truck stops or in quiet forest areas most nights, but I had this weird idea one day when I saw an old cemetery on the side of a rural road in Arkansas. What if I just camped there? It was late October, and I had pulled off on a small highway outside a town called Newton Ridge. It wasn't even on most maps. I just refilled gas at the last open station before dark. I'd been driving all day, mostly just taking random lefts and rights off country roads. At some point, I ended up coasting along this narrow dirt road, hardly wider than my car, when I passed a rusted metal sign that said, Maple Hollow Cemetery, 1883. I slowed down and backed up, just out of curiosity. The place was tucked maybe 30 yards back from the road, hidden behind a row of pines. There wasn't much to it, just a crooked old gate, half hanging open, and a bunch of mossy headstones sticking out of tall grass like broken teeth. No lights, no fences. It looked completely forgotten. I wasn't spooked by stuff like that. I had a good tent and plenty of supplies. I figured it would be quiet. No one would bother me. Nobody was going to visit a forgotten graveyard in the middle of nowhere on a Tuesday night. I parked just off the road and walked in with my gear. The air was heavy and cold, and everything smelled like wet leaves and dirt. You know that smell after it rains, but before it dries out? That clinging, earthy kind of damp. The sky was overcast and dull, but it wasn't raining. I had maybe an hour of daylight left. I picked a flat spot toward the back of the cemetery, near a huge fallen oak that looked like it had collapsed years ago. The branches were dead and covered in vines. The ground there was soft, and I had enough space to pitch my one-person tent. I took my time setting up, careful not to knock over any of the stones around me. The graves were old, really old. Most of them were worn down to where you couldn't even read the names. Some just had initials. A few had big, tilted slabs, and one near me had a rusted iron fence around it like someone had tried to protect it a long time ago. It felt more like a junkyard for stones than a place where people still remembered anyone buried there. I set up a small camp stove a few feet from my tent and boiled some instant noodles. It was already dark by the time I ate. I sat on a foam pad outside the tent, eating with gloves on. It was colder than I expected for Arkansas in late October. I wore 2 jackets and kept my headlamp strapped across my forehead, the dim red light helping preserve my night vision. I didn't feel scared. Not then. Just isolated, which I liked. When I finished eating, I packed everything away. I didn't want to leave food out. I wasn't worried about people, but animals were a different thing. I zipped up the tent and got into my sleeping bag, scrolling a bit on my phone while the signal lasted. It was weak, barely 1 bar. Then I put it on airplane mode to save battery and tried to sleep. I think I drifted off around 10 p.m. The wind had picked up by then, and I could hear the trees groaning. I woke up the first time around midnight to a sound that I couldn't place. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal either. It sounded like metal dragging against stone. I stayed still, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, like something scraping. Not a big noise, but sharp. Not steady either, more like a few seconds of noise, then silence. I sat up inside the tent, holding my breath. I thought maybe something fell. Maybe a tree branch scraped against a headstone, or something old shifted and settled. But the sound came again, slow and deliberate. A scrape, a pause, then another scrape. I turned off airplane mode and tried to load the flashlight on my phone. No signal at all now, just a blank bar. I didn't unzip the tent. I just waited, holding my breath and listening. It was dead silent after that. Whatever it was, it stopped. I laid back down, thinking maybe I imagined it. The wind had picked up again. Maybe it really was just a branch. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Something felt off. The air inside the tent felt heavy and still, like the cold had settled deeper. I didn't hear any more noises, but I didn't relax either. I just laid there, awake and alert. Around 2 a.m., I heard another noise. This one was softer, like footsteps in grass. I wasn't imagining it. They were slow, not the light scurry of a raccoon or a deer running off. These were steady, careful steps. I could hear them crushing the long grass just outside my tent. I froze. The steps moved around the tent, not toward it, just around. Then they stopped. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I was fully awake now, heart pounding. I didn't have a weapon, just a pocket knife in my pack outside the tent. I regretted leaving my heavier flashlight out there too. Then the footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, moving away this time, toward the older graves, and then silence. I waited a long time, at least 20 minutes, not moving. Then I slowly unzipped the tent, just the top flap, enough to peek out. I didn't turn on any light. Everything was dark. I couldn't see anyone. but the grass was still swaying near the fence, even though the wind had stopped. I stayed there, peering out, shivering. Nothing moved for the longest time. I don't know why I didn't pack up and leave right then. I think I convinced myself it was a drifter, someone passing through, same as me. Maybe they didn't even notice me. Maybe they thought I wasn't there. I didn't want to panic and run into the woods, so I stayed. Somehow I fell asleep again. My body must have just given out from exhaustion. When I woke up, it was morning, cold and gray, but the sun was finally pushing light through the clouds. The cemetery looked different, less menacing in daylight, but something was wrong. Near the fenced grave about 15 feet from my tent, the dirt was disturbed. It looked like someone had been digging. I walked over slowly. The ground was soft, like it had been turned recently. There were fresh drag marks too, like something had been pulled across the ground, away from the grave and toward the woods behind the cemetery. I followed them. They led maybe 50 yards past the tree line to a spot where the brush had been trampled. There were 2 deep impressions in the dirt, side by side, like knees or hands had pressed down. More drag marks. Then I saw the tarp. It was brown, camouflaged, half buried under leaves. I pulled it back slowly, heart racing. Underneath was a hole, not deep but wide, like someone had started digging but hadn't finished. There were broken branches, pieces of wood, and bones. Animal bones, I hoped. I really hoped. There were clothes too, torn jeans, a flannel shirt, an old boot, and next to it all, a small shovel with dried dirt on the blade. That's when I started to realize what I'd stumbled into. Someone had been living there. Someone had been using the graveyard for something, and they were probably still nearby. I backed away slowly, never turning my back to the trees. I moved quickly but carefully, packed everything in less than 2 minutes, and jogged back to the car. I didn't stop to take down the tent properly. I just stuffed it all into the trunk and left the stove behind. I didn't see anyone on the way out, but I felt eyes on me the entire drive back to the highway. Once I had signal again, I called the Newton Ridge Sheriff's Office. I gave them the location, what I'd seen, and told them everything. They didn't sound surprised. The dispatcher just said she'd send a deputy out. That was it. I didn't go back. I didn't want to know what they found. For weeks after that, I kept expecting to hear something on the news, but I never did. I looked up missing persons in the area. I even checked old crime reports from that county. Nothing matched. Sometimes I wonder if the person who was out there even cared that I saw what I saw. Maybe I didn't matter. Maybe I was just another passerby, someone who didn't stay long enough to get involved. I haven't camped in a cemetery since. That one night in Maple Hollow was enough. Now, whenever I find myself driving through back roads or looking for a quiet place to sleep, I stick to places where I can see the sky, where there's wind and traffic and maybe a little noise. Places where no one tries to disappear. Because in places like that old graveyard, people aren't just buried. Sometimes they hide, and sometimes they wait. It was the summer of 2014. I was 29 years old and had been living in Kansas City for about a year. My job kept me stuck at a desk most days, staring at spreadsheets, and I was burnt out. So, one Friday morning, I packed my gear into the back of my old Dodge Dakota, filled the cooler with enough supplies for a couple of days, and headed south out of the city without telling anyone exactly where I was going. I just wanted a break from everything. No calls, no emails, no traffic, no voices. Just trees, a fire, and quiet. I drove about 2.5 hours into the Flint Hills, away from the paved roads and the gas stations and the noise. There's a patch of land near an abandoned railway spur west of a town called Madison, barely even marked on most maps. I'd been out there once before with a friend back in college, and I remembered how isolated it was. Not an official campsite, just public land scattered with scrub, cottonwoods, and tracks that hadn't seen a train in at least 20 years. You have to cut across some dirt roads to get to the general area, then walk another 20 minutes to find a decent clearing. The sun was high when I parked along a gravel pull-off by a dry creek bed. I left my phone in the glove compartment, grabbed my pack, rifle, tent, and a couple bottles of water, and started walking down the faint deer trail leading toward the tracks. The air smelled dry, full of dust and distant hay. Grasshoppers flicked around my legs as I walked. I passed a broken fence, then a dead tree still wrapped with rusty barbed wire, then finally reached the old rail line. The ties were cracked, and the rails had mostly been stripped. A few iron segments still stuck out like ribs through the overgrown weeds. I followed the track south for a while, then cut off into the trees, remembering a small meadow tucked beside a slope near a half-buried signal box. When I found it, it looked just like I remembered. Flat enough to set up a tent, some space for a fire pit, and the trees were far enough apart that I could see the stars once night came. I set up camp fast. Tent went up fine. Fire pit was already half dug out from before, just needed a little clearing. I gathered wood, stacked some to dry near the rocks, and sat for a while just listening. No cars, no planes, no wind even, just the buzzing of insects and the soft groan of the heat settling in the trees. Around 5 p.m., I cooked a couple sausages over the fire, split a warm beer, and watched the sun get low. I didn't bring books or a radio, just wanted to sit still and let the world pass me by for a night. After the sun dipped below the hills, the sky started turning deep orange and purple. I could hear owls far off and the occasional rustle of something small moving through the brush. Rabbits, maybe. Nothing big. Nothing worth worrying about. I cleaned up camp, secured the food away from the tent, and sat beside the fire with a small flashlight in my hand. Didn't need it much. The flames were enough. I remember staring at the flicker on the rocks and feeling something like peace settle in me. That kind of peace you only feel when you're out far enough that no one can reach you unless they mean to. But peace doesn't last out there. Just after 9 p.m., I heard a sound that didn't fit. A snap. Not loud, not right beside me, but definite. Not the dry crack of a branch falling or the scurry of a raccoon. It was a footstep, measured, deliberate, coming from the east side of the camp, just beyond where the slope began to rise. I froze, didn't move, didn't shine my light, just listened. 10 seconds passed. 20. I heard another step. I reached slowly for the rifle. It was leaning against the log to my right, already loaded but not chambered. I didn't point it anywhere, just kept it in my lap and waited. Could have been a deer, or maybe even a hiker passing through, although that would be strange. This wasn't a trail. This wasn't even close to a trail. You had to know this place to find it. After a minute of stillness, I shone the light toward the slope. Nothing, just brush and shadows. No eyes shining back, no movement. I stayed like that for another 10 minutes, then put more wood on the fire to keep it going bright and stayed up. The peace I'd felt earlier was gone. My heart wasn't racing, not yet, but there was a weight in my chest that hadn't been there before. Around 10:30, I heard it again, this time on the other side, west, down by where the trees started thickening. Another step, then nothing, then 2 quick crunches like someone shifting their feet. I stood up with the rifle, light pointed, scanning back and forth. The brush swayed a little, but there wasn't any wind. Still no eyes, still no animal sounds. I thought about leaving right then, but walking back to the truck meant at least 25 minutes through total darkness with thick brush and high grass on both sides of the path. If someone was out there, they could easily follow, or cut me off. Out here, distance meant something different. You could be 40 feet from a person and not see them if they stayed low. And that feeling stuck with me. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to scare me. They weren't making noise or yelling or trying to be obvious. They were just letting me know, little by little, that I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep. I stayed up by the fire with my rifle across my lap and my flashlight in my left hand, scanning the perimeter every few minutes. Around midnight, the noises stopped. Or maybe I just stopped hearing them. I was tired, body aching from sitting up straight so long, eyes starting to blur from staring into the dark. Then something happened I still think about every time I close my eyes. At 2:17 a.m., I know because I finally gave in and checked my watch. I heard the faintest metallic clink. Not loud, not harsh, like a rock tapping a piece of iron. Came from the tracks. About 30 yards away, down the path I came in on. It repeated once, then again, then it stopped. It wasn't the sound of something falling. It was too spaced out, too clean. I stood up slowly and walked a few feet from the fire, just to get a better angle through the trees. I turned off the flashlight and let my eyes adjust to the moonlight. That's when I saw it. Not a figure, not a person, but movement. Someone had stacked rocks, just 4 of them, into a tiny pyramid right on the edge of one of the remaining rail segments. That hadn't been there earlier. I was sure of it. I would have stepped over it when I arrived. And now it was there, placed neatly like a marker. A message, or worse, bait. I backed away slowly, keeping the fire behind me and the rifle up. Still no sounds, no talking, no running. Whoever had done it was gone now, or hiding. I didn't go to sleep after that. I waited until the first hint of gray showed in the sky, then packed everything in under 5 minutes. Didn't even roll the tent properly, just stuffed it into the pack and strapped it shut. I didn't eat, didn't drink, just started walking, keeping the rifle in one hand and the flashlight in the other. I didn't take the same path back to the truck. Instead, I looped wide, sticking to the edges of the treeline, moving fast but trying not to make too much noise. I expected to see someone standing at the rail bed or watching from behind a tree, but I didn't. Just morning silence and that low, distant hum of a breeze starting to return. When I finally reached the truck, I unlocked it with shaking hands and threw everything in the back without organizing it. My boots were covered in dew and seeds and burrs. I slammed the door, locked it again, and peeled out down the gravel, nearly fishtailing on the curve. I didn't stop driving until I was an hour out. I pulled into a gas station, got coffee, and sat in the lot for a long time with the engine running and the doors locked. I watched the sun rise all the way over the hills and felt a pain behind my eyes that hadn't been there the day before. Nothing ever came of it. I didn't report anything. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't lose anything. But that trip changed how I feel about being alone in the woods. I've gone camping since, but always at public campsites, always within cell range, and never alone. What stuck with me the most wasn't the noise or the rocks or even the idea that someone was watching. It was that calmness, that total, deliberate quiet, like whoever was out there had done it before, like they knew just how to stay out of sight, how to make themselves felt without ever showing themselves. It's been years since that night. I don't have nightmares about it, but I think about it more than I should, about how far out I was, how no one would have found me for days if something had happened, and how sometimes the scariest part isn't what's out there in the dark, but what's willing to wait quietly just long enough to make you doubt your own safety. I never went back to that spot. I never even tried to find it on a map again. But sometimes, when I hear metal click or stones tumble together, I get that feeling again, that someone is watching and they want me to know it, just not all at once, just slowly, quietly, like they've got all night. I was 28 when I took that trip out to the San Juan National Forest in Colorado. It was late September 2012, just before the colder air really settled in, and most tourists had already cleared out. I'd been working construction nonstop for nearly 10 months, taking side jobs on weekends, and saving every bit I could. I didn't have many people to talk to, no girlfriend at the time, and no real plans besides getting out of the city for a while and shutting out the world. I packed my old truck with a few essentials: tent, cold weather sleeping bag, a small propane stove, my old Winchester rifle just in case, canned food, jerky, trail mix, a couple gallons of water, my headlamp, batteries, a map of the area, and some clothes layered for the coming cold. I didn't care about bringing fancy gear or electronics. I wanted quiet. I wanted isolation. I drove west out of Denver and spent the first night in a roadside pull-off near Pagosa Springs. Next morning, I filled up my tank, bought a few more supplies, and made my way deep into the national forest. I was headed toward an old logging road I'd seen years before during a weekend hike, one that most campers and hunters seemed to avoid because of how rough and narrow it was. That was exactly what I was looking for. After 2 hours of crawling through ruts and scraping the undercarriage on buried rocks, I found a flat spot near a shallow creek, surrounded by tall pines and thick brush. It was about a half-mile off the main logging road, down a barely visible game trail that looked like it hadn't been used much in years. It felt right. Quiet, shaded, and so still I could hear my own heartbeat when I turned off the truck. I parked, pulled my gear out, set up the tent, and gathered enough wood for a fire. It was cold but not bitter, and the air had that dry bite that hits the back of your throat. The first day passed peacefully. I made a fire, ate some beans and jerky, sipped a bit of whiskey I brought, and listened to the wind shift through the trees. The sound of moving pine needles, the occasional snapping of a twig from a deer or something moving in the distance. It was the kind of solitude I craved. I stayed 3 days without anything out of the ordinary. I hiked during the day, read a little, kept to myself, and didn't even check my phone. I had it turned off the entire time. I made sure to leave minimal traces, no trash left behind, campfire carefully tended. I was trying to stay off anyone's radar. But on the fourth night, things started to feel off. It started small, barely noticeable. Just before dusk, I was walking back to camp after filtering water from the creek when I noticed some tracks in the mud that weren't mine. They were boot prints, slightly smaller than mine, heading toward the trees north of where my tent was. First, I brushed it off. Maybe I'd walked that way earlier and just forgot. But the prints were deeper than mine, fresher, and only going in one direction. Not a set coming back. That stuck in my mind. That night, I couldn't relax. I built a fire like usual and tried to eat, but I kept glancing into the woods, checking over my shoulder. The quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, like the air itself was waiting for something. I didn't sleep much. I lay in my bag, rifle next to me, listening. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I heard soft crunching outside the tent. Not like an animal moving through, too slow, too measured. Just a few steps, then stillness. Then a minute or two later, a few more. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I just lay there, every muscle tensed, trying to slow my breathing. I don't know how long it went on. Could have been 5 minutes or 30. But eventually, the sounds stopped, and I didn't hear them again. Next morning, I found nothing obvious. No new tracks, no signs of anyone messing with my gear. But I couldn't shake the unease. I considered packing up, but I told myself maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe it was just a deer moving weird. Maybe a bear. Maybe the wind. Still, I moved my tent closer to a dense thicket, less visible from the trail. I didn't make a fire that night. Ate cold food. Sat quiet, trying to convince myself it was just in my head. That night, though, I heard something again. Only this time, it was clearer. A branch snapping. Slow footsteps, heavier than a deer, deliberate. Then, nothing. When I woke up, my water jug was gone. Not tipped over or half spilled, gone. I found the cap a few feet away from where I'd left it. That was when the fear really started to set in. I knew no animal had taken that. I kept all my gear tightly packed. The jug had been behind my tent, wedged between 2 rocks to keep it upright. It hadn't rolled. Someone had taken it. I grabbed my rifle and went in a wide circle around the camp. No one, no signs, but the brush was thick, and anyone could have been watching. I kept quiet all day and didn't move much. By nightfall, I'd made the decision to leave the next morning. I didn't want to panic, but something wasn't right. Just after sunset, while I was packing some gear back into the truck, I heard movement again, closer this time. Then a metallic sound, faint, like something brushing against the tailgate of the truck. I froze, holding my breath. I waited, listening. Then another sound, soft footsteps moving off to the right, into the thicker trees. I waited a long time before creeping over with the flashlight. There, on the side of the truck bed, were fresh scratches, small but noticeable, like someone had rubbed something metal against it. I backed away, turned off the light, and got into the tent. I barely slept. The first light, I packed everything as quickly as I could. No breakfast, no cleanup, just got everything shoved into the truck. As I was closing up the tailgate, I looked over toward the creek and saw something that made my stomach drop. There was a figure standing on the far side, barely visible between the trees, wearing dark clothes, arms hanging low, just standing there, not moving, watching. I didn't hesitate. I jumped in the truck and started it up. I didn't look back as I drove through the brush, scraping the sides, bouncing over rocks. I hit the main logging road and didn't stop until I reached pavement 2 hours later. I kept driving until I hit the outskirts of Durango. I booked a cheap motel and stayed inside with the curtains shut, rifle at arm's reach. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't call the cops. I didn't know what I'd say. Over the next few days, I tried to forget it. I told myself maybe it was a hunter or another camper, maybe even some off-grid type who didn't like people nearby. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The prints, the footsteps, the missing water, the scratches, the figure. None of that was accidental. Someone had been watching me, not from a distance either. They'd been close enough to sneak around my camp at night, close enough to take things without being heard, close enough to stand and watch me leave. I never went back to that part of Colorado again. I started camping closer to designated sites, places with other people nearby. I still enjoy the outdoors, but that feeling of being hunted, of being watched silently in the dark, that never really leaves. I started locking my truck at night, even in remote areas. I sleep with one ear open, always listening. And every so often, when I'm alone in the woods and the fire burns low, I remember that still figure near the creek, just standing there, waiting. I got out of there, but something tells me whoever that was, he stayed. He probably watches that trail still, maybe waiting for the next person who thinks they've found a perfect quiet spot, maybe waiting for someone who won't get out as lucky as I did. It was early November of 2013. I was 32 at the time, living alone just outside of Rapid City, South Dakota. I worked in construction, mostly roofing and framing, and whenever the weather allowed it, I tried to get away into the woods. I'd been hunting since I was a teenager, mostly deer, sometimes birds, and every now and then I'd just go out to camp and hike without even bringing a rifle. That year, I had a few days off between projects, so I planned a solo trip up to the Black Hills National Forest. I'd been there plenty of times, but this time I wanted to push deeper into an area I hadn't been before. Northwest of Hill City, way past where most people go, off any designated camping zones. I wasn't looking for trophy bucks or anything like that. I just wanted quiet, solitude, and the kind of hunting that took real patience. There was a spot near an old fire road that I found on a topographical map, mostly ridges and valleys with some flat pine groves. It seemed perfect. I packed everything in my truck: my .270 rifle, sleeping bag, freeze-dried food, propane stove, water filter, extra ammo, trail maps, compass, and first aid gear. I didn't bring a GPS. I trusted my compass and maps. I also carried a flare gun, mostly for emergencies. I left early on a Wednesday morning. The drive out there took around 2 hours, then another 45 minutes of crawling through rough forest roads before I parked. After that, it was all foot travel. I carried everything in on my back. It took me just over 4 hours of hiking to get to the spot I had marked, but when I arrived, it felt right. Quiet, dense pines, signs of deer, no trash, no human tracks, just what I was looking for. I set up camp on a flat rise above a little draw. There was a small stream a couple hundred yards downhill, easy access for water. I pitched my one-man tent, dug a little fire ring, and prepped some wood. I could only use a fire at night since smoke could spook any game in the area, and I wanted to stay low-key. I cooked dinner just after dusk, instant rice and a packet of tuna, and got into my bag early. It was cold, but nothing extreme, maybe low 30s that night. The next few days were mostly quiet. I scouted in the mornings, glassed ridges and open patches from a few elevated spots. On day 2, I saw 3 mule deer down in the valley, 2 does and a young buck. Too far for a shot, and I didn't want to risk wounding anything without a clean line. I figured I'd see more the next day. By the 3rd day, I hadn't taken any shots. I'd seen movement but never had a perfect opportunity. Still, I wasn't in a rush. The point of the trip was the peace, not the kill. I kept everything in order, tracked my trail markers, checked my compass every time I moved, always circled back before dark. It was routine, I had no cell service out there, which was expected. I liked it that way. It was the fourth night when things started to feel wrong. That evening, I made a small fire and boiled water for another freeze-dried meal. The wind had picked up a little, and I noticed it was quieter than usual. The birds that normally chirped in the late dusk were gone. No rustling, no deer movement, just the wind pushing through the tops of the pines. I told myself maybe a predator had moved into the area, coyote, maybe even a cougar, but I hadn't seen any signs of that. No scat, no tracks. Still, I kept my rifle close that night. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to a sound. Not an animal sound. It was the snapping, branches breaking, maybe 40 feet from my tent. I sat up instantly, heart pounding. I reached for the rifle, slow and quiet, and just waited. I turned off my headlamp. I didn't want to light myself up in case something or someone was nearby. I heard one more snap, then nothing. Silence, just the wind again. I waited for over an hour, just sitting in the tent with my back stiff and my ears trying to catch anything. Eventually, I drifted off again, but I kept my boots on. In the morning, I stepped outside and did a full circle around the tent. I expected to see something, animal tracks, broken branches, maybe even a fallen tree limb, but I didn't see anything out of place. Nothing was touched. My food bag was still tied up in the tree where I'd hung it. No signs of paw prints, just pine needles and frost. I told myself I probably overreacted. Could have been a branch falling from the wind. Still, something was eating at me. I hunted a little that day, but my focus wasn't there. I kept looking over my shoulder, listening for footsteps that never came. The air just felt heavier. I marked some blood on the ground mid-morning, maybe from a rabbit or something small, but it looked fresh and was smeared, like it had been dragged. I crouched down over it for a while, trying to make sense of it. It led into the trees, but faded off after about 30 feet. I didn't follow it far. My gut told me not to. That night, I almost packed up. I'd had a few successful days of quiet. I hadn't shot anything, but I had enough experience to know when it's time to go. Still, stubbornness kept me there. I told myself I'd do one more night, break camp in the morning, and hike out. The wind had died down, and I figured whatever spooked the woods had moved on. I made a fire early and turned in just after dark, planning to leave before sunrise. Sometime around midnight, I woke up again. This time not from a sound, but from a feeling. I couldn't explain it. Just this wave of panic, like someone had thrown cold water on my chest. My tent was zipped shut. No wind, no noises, but I was wide awake. I reached for the rifle again and just sat there, barely breathing. Then I heard it. Slow footsteps, not animal footsteps, not quick or skittish, just a steady, careful pace. One footfall, then a pause, then another, coming from the direction of the stream. They stopped about 20 feet away. I didn't move, couldn't. I don't think I even blinked. I just sat there in the dark, counting heartbeats. Whoever or whatever it was stayed still for what felt like forever. Then I heard the footsteps again, walking away. I waited another hour before I moved. I didn't open the tent. I didn't turn on a light. I just stayed perfectly still until the sky began to lighten. When I stepped outside that morning, I found the prints. Boot prints. Not mine. They came up from the stream bed and circled my tent. Close, maybe 6 or 7 feet away at the nearest point. The tracks were shallow but clear. Someone had been there. They weren't dragging anything, weren't running. Just walking, slow and steady. They didn't lead anywhere obvious. Just into the woods, then disappeared over the rise. That was enough for me. I packed up fast. I didn't eat breakfast, didn't filter more water. I stuffed everything into my pack and started hiking out before the sun even cleared the trees. I kept my rifle slung but ready. I didn't stop to rest. Took me 5 hours to get back to the truck. Longer than it should have. I kept looking back, cutting off trail to avoid choke points, circling around ridges just to stay out of clearings. The entire hike, I never saw another human. No sounds, no animals, just wind again. When I finally got to the truck, I tossed my gear in without organizing anything and got the hell out of there. I drove until I hit the main road, then pulled over and just sat for a while. I didn't even start thinking clearly until I got home that evening. I didn't tell anyone about it at first. Who was I going to tell? There was no crime, no confrontation, just the kind of encounter that leaves your instincts screaming, even if your brain can't explain why. A few weeks later, I mentioned it to an old coworker who'd done search and rescue. He told me that area wasn't popular for hunters, but they'd occasionally found old camps way out there. Not illegal stuff, just off-grid types. Loners. Folks who didn't want to be found. That's all he said. I haven't been back to that part of the forest since. I still hunt. I still camp alone. But now I stay closer to known trails, known grounds. I use GPS alongside my compass. I leave notes about where I'm going. And I always leave when my gut tells me to, because I still think about those footsteps. The way they stopped just outside my tent. How they didn't run, didn't speak, didn't try anything. They just watched. And to this day, I don't know which would have been worse, that it was a stranger out there in the woods, or that it wasn't. In the fall of 2016, I took a solo camping trip in northern New Mexico, just outside the town of Chama. I was 33 years old at the time and working as a freelance photographer. I had spent a few years doing short stints in different parts of the Southwest, and the plan was to spend 5 days alone out in the backcountry to shoot the changing leaves and get away from screens. I wasn't running from anything dramatic. I just liked being alone sometimes. I grew up in Wyoming, so the cold didn't bother me much, and I had plenty of backwoods experience. I had been in bear country before. I was always cautious, and I didn't do dumb stuff. I chose a spot near the Brazos Cliffs, about 6 miles off the trail. The road into the area was already rough gravel and washed out in places, so I left my truck at a marked turnout and carried my gear the rest of the way by foot. I had a 70-liter pack with a small tent, food for 5 days, water, purification tablets, my camera gear, a .357 revolver I usually took for bears, and a bunch of layered clothes for the cold. I had planned the hike in with an old USGS map and GPS. I kept both on me at all times. I also had a small spot beacon in case of emergency. I didn't expect to use it. The first 2 days were perfect. I found a small flat area surrounded by tall fir trees not far from a stream. The stream curved between 2 hills and had a shallow drop, so the running water helped mask little sounds from the woods. That always made me sleep better. I set up my tent on the second day after hiking further uphill to scout locations. I had about 3 good vantage points marked for morning and evening shots. My feet were sore, but it was the good kind of sore. The kind that reminds you you're doing something real. I fell asleep early that night with the sound of the water running and no light around me but stars. It was the third night when things started to feel strange. Around 2 a.m., I woke up needing to pee. It had dropped below freezing, and the tent's walls were stiff with frost. I got out with my headlamp on low and walked a short distance behind a thick pine. The woods were dark and silent except for the faint trickling of the stream. No wind, no insects, just stillness. After I zipped back up and turned to head to the tent, I saw something move past my peripheral vision, just at the edge of where my headlamp's beam hit. It wasn't big, human-sized, maybe smaller. It darted between 2 tree trunks. I froze for a second, more confused than scared. I didn't think animal at first. The way it moved didn't feel right. It wasn't a deer or bear. It was too low to be an elk, and it didn't make any noise. No crunching leaves, no sticks breaking. I stared into the darkness for another minute, my light aimed at the trees. Then I swept the beam side to side a few times. Nothing. I went back to the tent quickly but didn't run. I locked the zipper and sat in my bag with my revolver next to me. I told myself it could have been a raccoon or coyote, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. My stomach felt tight, and my ears stayed locked onto every sound outside. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, the frost was heavier. I got up at dawn and checked around the area where I saw the thing move. The ground was covered with pine needles and some frozen mud, but I found what looked like 2 smudged marks, almost like prints, but not boots. Just odd shapes pressed into the ground that didn't match anything I knew. I brushed them off. Could have been from deer, maybe a mountain lion that dragged its paws. Could have even been mine from the previous day and distorted by frost. I pushed the thought out of my head. That day, I took shots up the ridge and stayed out until sunset. I made sure to mark my trail back with surveyor's tape I always carry, just in case. I returned to camp cold and tired. I tried not to think about what I'd seen the night before. I didn't want to pack up early and leave. It would have felt like I'd lost, like I got scared of a shadow. I made a small fire with a pit I'd dug earlier and warmed some soup. As I sat eating, I kept hearing these soft, scattered taps in the trees behind me. Not animals, not the regular forest sounds I was used to. It sounded like something slowly circling me, just far enough out that I couldn't see anything but tree trunks. I turned off my headlamp and listened hard. The moon was out, and my eyes adjusted a little, but I never saw anything. The taps continued, stopping now and then, starting again in new spots. I left the fire burning and sat inside my tent with the zipper open slightly and the revolver on my lap. At some point during the night, something brushed the side of the tent. It wasn't the wind. The material pressed in lightly in two places like hands or paws. Then it backed off. I didn't move. I just sat still, listening. I couldn't hear breathing or footsteps. Nothing. But I knew something was there. It wasn't a hallucination. I was fully awake. That was the first night I really thought about the stories. The skinwalker stuff. I didn't believe in that kind of thing. Still don't. But it's hard not to go there when you're alone in the middle of nowhere and something human-shaped is stalking you in total silence. I stayed up all night again, eyes fixed on the tent wall and ears locked on every tiny sound. In the early morning light, I stepped out, revolver drawn, and walked the perimeter of camp. Nothing was out of place, but there were more of those smudged indentations in the dirt. 4 of them, spaced out like footsteps, too big for a dog, not shaped like boots or shoes. They looked more like misshapen bare feet. I packed everything up fast. I started the hike back around 8 a.m. The air was sharp, and frost clung to the low brush as I pushed downhill toward where I'd left my truck. I kept scanning behind me every few minutes. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being followed. At one point, about halfway down the ridge, I turned and saw something standing still between 2 trees way off, too far to make out clearly, but I saw it for a split second. Then it crouched low and vanished behind a rise. I took off fast but careful. No brakes. I stopped drinking water just so I wouldn't have to stop moving. I made it to my truck around 3 p.m., threw my gear into the back without sorting it, and got out of there. Even as I drove, I kept checking the mirror like whatever it was might be following me all the way to pavement. I didn't stop until I hit Chama. I stayed in a motel that night and sat in the shower for an hour. I kept replaying it in my head over and over, trying to make it into something simple. Coyote, a cougar, something explainable. But it wasn't. Not the way it moved, not the way it watched. A few days later, back in Santa Fe, I reviewed all my camera footage and audio. I'd set up a trail cam the first night aimed toward the stream, mostly to catch wildlife at dawn. The first 2 days were normal. A rabbit, pair of mule deer. On the third night, though, something tripped the sensor around 2:14 a.m. One frame caught it. It was blurry, off-center, but it was there, not an animal. It looked like a person, but hunched, almost crawling on all fours. The limbs were wrong, too long, and the head was turned toward the camera. The eyes glowed from the flash. It wasn't a costume. You can always tell. The body was too lean. It looked real. I deleted it. I don't know why I did that, but I didn't want to see it again. I told myself for months afterward it was just some weird hermit or a poacher playing games. But that didn't fit either. You don't live out there without leaving trash, smoke, fire pits. You don't stalk someone without eventually making a mistake. Whoever or whatever it was, it never made a sound. Never left a print I could understand. Never let itself be seen for more than a second. I never went back. That was 9 years ago now. I've camped since, but always in familiar areas. Always near other people. I don't go deep solo anymore. Not even close. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster from a book. but it was real. And it's still out there, I'm sure. Whatever people want to call it, skinwalker, mimic, cryptid, fine. I don't care about the name. I just know what I saw, what I felt, what followed me, and I know I was lucky to leave. I was 33 when I decided to go on that solo camping trip. It was late October 2019, and the weather was already starting to turn in Washington state. I had been working 6-day weeks at a construction company in Tacoma, and I felt burnt out, restless. I didn't want to wait until winter hit fully and the trails closed or got too risky. I wanted a few days away from the traffic, noise, and concrete. So I packed up my old black Toyota Tacoma, threw in my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, a small propane stove, extra layers, and headed out to the Olympic National Forest. I didn't have a set destination, just a rough plan to hike a few miles into the woods, find a flat spot near a creek, and be alone. I didn't tell many people, just my cousin, Danny, who I texted that morning. He was used to me doing stuff like this. I told him I'd be back Sunday night, and if I wasn't, to check in on me. I left Tacoma around 10 a.m. and stopped once for gas and a sandwich. The rain had been off and on all day, light and misty, just enough to smear the windshield. By the time I pulled off Highway 101 near a less used forest road, it was about 2:30 in the afternoon. I found a little gravel pull-off and parked under some tall pines, no other cars in sight. I should have paid more attention to the clouds. The trail I picked wasn't really a trail, just a faint game path. I followed it anyway, winding through thick brush, slippery with moisture. My boots got wet quick, and the temperature was dropping. The ground was a mix of soft pine needles and slick mud. I walked for about an hour and a half before settling on a spot maybe 2 miles in. There was a clearing just big enough for a small tent and a slow-moving creek nearby. I was completely alone. I couldn't hear the highway, no planes overhead, just the constant whisper of wind and water. Felt peaceful. I set up camp fast, tent first, then unpacked my gear. I had a lightweight tarp I stretched over the tent to help with the rain, and I gathered some damp branches to make a small fire, more for comfort than heat. I got it going with some dry tinder I brought in a Ziploc. The flame was weak but steady. I boiled some water for instant ramen and sat there with my rain jacket zipped to the top, eating and staring at the fire. There was no phone service out there, which I expected, and I didn't bring a GPS or anything. Just a topo map in a plastic bag and a compass. By 6, the sky was already dark. A thick wall of clouds had rolled in, and the woods got real quiet. I crawled into my tent with my flashlight, pulled off my wet boots, and changed into dry socks and thermal pants. I was cozy inside the sleeping bag, and I dozed off quick, even with the rain tapping steady on the tarp. I woke up a few hours later to a sharp sound. Not thunder, not an animal. It was a snapping twig. Loud. Close. My tent was lit by the soft glow of the lantern I'd left on low, hanging from the top loop. My ears strained. Rain still fell, light now but steady. Then another sound, more deliberate, like footsteps, slow, crunching in the wet forest floor, maybe 15 feet from my tent. I lay perfectly still, heart thudding. I know the sounds of animals. Deer, raccoons, even bears. This was different. This was slower, heavier. I reached for the hatchet I always kept next to me when camping. My hand gripped it tight, sweaty even in the cold. I waited. Nothing. Just the rain. After about 20 minutes, I convinced myself it was just a branch falling. Maybe an elk or a curious animal sniffing around. But I didn't sleep again for a while. The next morning, the forest was soaked. Mist curled between the trees, and everything was dripping. I stepped out stiffly, stretched, and took a leak behind a log. I scanned the area. No tracks. Nothing obvious. I made some instant coffee and ate a granola bar. I spent the day hiking around the nearby area, keeping close to camp. I saw some deer scat and a few fresh tracks, but no sign of anyone or anything unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I made a fire again. The damp wood smoked more than it burned. I sat close, trying to stay warm. The clouds were darker, heavier. Rain was coming again, and it wasn't going to be light. I climbed back into the tent around 8 p.m. and checked everything: zippers, latches, tarp ties. I tucked my backpack inside the vestibule and made sure my boots were upside down and dry. At around midnight, the real storm hit. Rain hammered the tarp above me like fists. Wind shook the trees, and I could hear the creek rising. I laid there wide awake, listening. Then, again, the sound of movement. This time, there was no mistaking it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, maybe 10 feet away, right outside my tent. Not circling, just standing. I gripped my hatchet and held my breath. I wanted to shout or make noise, but my instincts told me to stay silent. The steps moved, not away, but closer. Then I saw it. A shadow on the tent wall. Broad shoulders. Person. Standing completely still. Not moving. Just there. My throat went dry. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The figure stayed for what felt like forever. Then it vanished. I waited another hour before I finally worked up the nerve to unzip the tent and peek out. Nothing. The woods were pitch black. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I was done. I packed up as quick as I could, barely eating. I was cold, soaked, tired. My tent had leaked in one corner, and the forest felt hostile now. Angry, I slung my gear on my back and started heading out. But I didn't make it far before I stopped dead in my tracks. Right where the game trail began, where I first entered the forest, there was a boot print. Fresh, not mine, bigger, deep in the mud, and pointed toward my campsite, not away from it. Someone had followed me in. And then I noticed something else. A broken branch, freshly snapped, bent at an angle like someone brushed past it. Then, a few feet away, a torn piece of plastic. It was black and crinkled. I picked it up. A corner of a garbage bag, probably from someone's pack. Not mine. That was when I knew. I hadn't been alone out there. Picked up my pace, heart racing. I moved quick, ignoring the soreness in my legs. I kept looking behind me, listening. I had my hatchet in one hand the whole time. The forest felt different now. I couldn't tell if someone was watching me or just the memory of that shadow was haunting me. But either way, I didn't slow down. I reached my truck by noon, panting, soaking wet, and more exhausted than I've ever been. I threw my gear in the bed, peeled off my wet jacket, and sat behind the wheel trying to calm my breathing. I turned the ignition, but then I froze again. A second set of boot prints fresh in the mud right next to mine by the truck, leading up to the driver's side. Whoever had been out there had followed me all the way back. Maybe had even been here while I was still packing up camp. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. I locked the doors, reversed fast, and drove all the way back to town without stopping once. Later that night, when I finally got a signal, I texted Danny I was home safe. I didn't tell him what happened. Not then. The next day, I filed a report with the local ranger station. They didn't find anything. No signs of squatters, no missing hikers, nothing suspicious. Just my story noted in their book. I haven't camped alone since then. Not once. I still go into the woods. Still hike. Still love the silence and the trees. But I carry more now. And I sleep lighter. And I never forget the shape of that shadow. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't some fantasy or campfire tale. It was a man. Someone who followed me deep into the forest in the middle of a storm and stood outside my tent for reasons I'll never understand. But I got out. I went home. I was lucky, and I'll never let myself be that vulnerable again. It was early September 2016 when I decided to go camping alone in northern Idaho. I just turned 29 a few weeks earlier, and I'd been needing to get away from everything. Life had gotten busy. I had a job in Coeur d'Alene that kept me on my feet 6 days a week, working maintenance for a small property management company, fixing toilets, patching drywall, dealing with tenants. It was starting to get under my skin. I needed the silence. I drove about 3.5 hours northeast, near a spot called Yaak. The area around there gets remote real fast. Once you pass Bonner's Ferry, the roads thin out and the woods feel thicker, wilder. No billboards, no traffic lights, and no real cell service. That's what I wanted. Peace, space, no emails. Just me and the trees for a weekend. The spot I picked wasn't on any official campground. I looked at maps and figured I could tuck myself in near a shallow stream just east of some Forest Service road. I'd read online that people sometimes dispersed camp there, and it seemed secluded enough without being dangerously deep into nowhere. I left my apartment on a Thursday morning, got gas in Sandpoint, and reached the trailhead around 2 in the afternoon. I parked where the gravel turned into dirt and slung my pack over my shoulder, carrying my tent, gear, and 3 days' worth of food. I hiked a few miles in, keeping an eye out for a level patch of ground close to water. The sun was still out, warming everything through the early fall air, and I remember thinking how good it felt just to breathe. By about 4:30, I found a flat patch of earth not far from the stream. There were signs that someone else had camped there before. A ring of rocks for a fire pit, some charcoal still tucked under stones, a couple sticks leaned up against a tree, but no trash, no human scent. Felt clean, undisturbed. I set up my tent, got my small fire going with some gathered wood, boiled water, and made myself instant mashed potatoes and canned chili. Felt like enough. I leaned back on my pack, watching the sky dim into a pale purple. No one for miles, just crickets, the sound of the stream, and the creaking of trees. That first night was quiet. No animals came through, no weird sounds. I slept decently, wrapped in my sleeping bag, waking a couple times to pee and look at the stars. But nothing strange happened. The second day, I woke early, just as the light broke. I went for a short hike along the water, moving upstream and following its twists until it narrowed to the point where I couldn't walk beside it anymore. I saw deer tracks in the mud and a couple of broken branches that looked like elk had moved through earlier in the season. Everything felt normal, peaceful, alive. That afternoon, I boiled some rice and tuna and sat by the fire pit again. But something shifted. I felt it more than saw it, like a pressure, like the woods weren't as empty as I thought. I paused my chewing and scanned the trees. No movement, no sound except the water and occasional birds. But the feeling stuck with me. I chalked it up to being alone, maybe just being out of practice. I'd spent a lot of weekends camping when I was younger, but this was my first solo trip in years. The mind can wander. You start imagining things. I told myself not to make up nonsense and tried to shake it off. Still, I kept my small hatchet tucked inside the tent flap that night, just in case. That night, I had a harder time sleeping. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. Just unease. I heard a few distant thumps around 1 a.m. Could have been animals. Probably were. But the steps sounded heavy. Not four-legged. Like someone pacing, but far off. I stayed still in my sleeping bag and kept my breathing shallow, ears straining. Nothing came close. The noise stopped after a few minutes. I eventually drifted off again, but my sleep was thin. The third day was when things got weird. I woke up to find something had moved near my sight. Not animals. My gear had shifted. My small metal cup that I used for boiling water was on its side 5 feet away from where I'd left it. One of my food bags had been picked up and set down behind the tent. Not torn or rummaged through, just moved, placed somewhere else. Deliberately, that's what bothered me. I stood there, holding that bag, and looked around again. No tracks. The ground was dry. No footprints. But I knew it hadn't been me. I wasn't that careless. I sat by the fire pit, letting the sun warm my back, thinking it through. Maybe someone had passed through and just didn't wake me. But why not take anything? Why move a cup? That day I didn't hike. I stayed close to camp, collecting wood, staying alert. That pressure I'd felt the day before was worse now. I kept looking over my shoulder, listening, waiting for movement that never came. It wasn't the woods making me nervous. It was the feeling that someone else was there, watching. I didn't eat much that evening. Just a couple granola bars and some water. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in my tent, wide awake. The forest felt like it was holding its breath. Around 11 p.m., I heard something, just outside the tent. A soft, slow crunching of leaves. One step, then nothing. Another step, Closer. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the flap. I just held the hatchet tight, heart thudding in my ears. Whoever it was didn't speak, didn't try to get in. They just walked near the tent, circled it once, then silence. I stayed frozen like that for an hour, maybe longer. I didn't hear them leave. I waited until light started bleeding into the fabric of the tent before I moved. When I finally stepped out, everything looked the same. No one there, but I noticed the small stack of rocks. 3 smooth stones, stacked on top of one another near the fire pit. I hadn't done that. That was it for me. I packed fast, rolled up the tent, stuffed the food, and got my boots on. My stomach was tight, like I was being watched from the trees. I didn't eat. I didn't boil water. I just left. The hike back to the car felt twice as long. Every snap of a twig made me spin. I didn't run, but I walked fast, nearly tripping more than once on roots and stones. I finally got back to the dirt road around noon. My car was still there, nothing touched, but across the hood, drawn with a finger in the thin layer of dust, was a circle with an X through it. I stared at it, heart hammering again. That wasn't there when I parked. I unlocked the doors, threw my gear in, and drove without stopping. Didn't pull over to eat, didn't turn on music, just drove. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station near Sandpoint and stood inside under the fluorescent lights like I just escaped something I couldn't explain. For days after that, I kept checking my apartment windows, kept locking the door twice. I didn't report anything. What would I even say? No crime had been committed. No one had stolen anything. But I know someone was out there. I know they came close. I know they wanted me to know. I never went back to that part of Idaho again. I still camp sometimes, but never alone, never without backup. And I never stay near unknown property lines or trails that aren't clearly marked. Whatever happened out there wasn't paranormal. It was human. That's what makes it worse. Because I know someone was there. I know they watched me. I know they stepped around my tent in the dark. And I know they wanted me to leave. And I did. I don't plan on going back. It was in the early fall of 2016 when I took that trip. I remember because the leaves had only just begun to turn yellow in the corners, and the nights were starting to get that sharp edge of cold to them. I was 28 then, working from home doing freelance CAD design for a few construction firms out of Atlanta. I lived in Mobile, Alabama, but I drove up to Tennessee to get away for a bit. Just me and the forest for a few nights. I thought I needed to clear my head. The place I picked was a quiet stretch of land near Roan Mountain State Park. Not one of the campgrounds, though. I wasn't really into staying around other campers. I'd found this patch of forest on a map, a little outside of the main trails, and I figured I'd try a more isolated experience for a change. I parked about a half-mile from a gravel Forestry Service road and hiked the rest of the way in. I had my old green canvas tent, the same one I'd been using since college. It leaked a little if the rain came in at a bad angle, but I knew how to rig a tarp up over it. I had a small propane burner, freeze-dried food, my dad's old hunting knife, a lightweight sleeping bag, and a flashlight that I'd tested a dozen times the week before. I felt prepared, and I probably was, at least for a normal trip. It started drizzling about 2 hours after I'd set up camp. I'd managed to get the tent pitched, a little fire started, and a tarp strung between 2 trees just high enough to sit under and read. I had a paperback of some old spy thriller that I never ended up finishing. The book got soaked later that night. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. The sound of light rain through the leaves, the way the smoke from my fire curled slowly into the air, the wet pine needles underfoot. There wasn't a single other soul around me. That's what I liked most. Just me, the woods, and the slow hush of falling rain. The rain picked up around nightfall. Not a storm yet, just steadier, colder. The kind that seeps into your shirt and makes you shiver before you even realize you're wet. I ate a quick meal, some kind of chili mix with hot water, and zipped myself up in the tent around 8. I remember checking my phone, seeing 0 bars, and tossing it into my backpack. I wasn't expecting to use it anyway. I just liked knowing I had it in case something went wrong. Around 11, I woke up. The rain had turned heavy. It was loud against the tarp, and I could hear the wind pushing it from one side to the other. A corner had come loose and started flapping. I thought about getting up to tie it back down, but the cold air outside the tent was enough to make me hesitate. I figured it could wait until morning. I closed my eyes again. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just a branch falling, some random thump out in the forest. But it happened again a minute later. It wasn't loud, just a soft sound, like something or someone stepping on wet leaves and pine needles. Too steady to be an animal, at least not one moving naturally. I held my breath. The wind pushed against the tent again, and the rain kept hammering the tarp. I stayed completely still, listening. Then another sound, a low rustling. It came from the side of the tent that faced the trees. It was faint, but it wasn't part of the wind. I knew that for sure. I grabbed my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to draw attention to myself if someone was out there. My knife was in my boot at the foot of the sleeping bag. I slid my foot out and slowly reached for it. Then came the sound of a stick breaking. It wasn't loud, just that sharp snap that makes your heart race when everything else is quiet. It sounded maybe 30 feet away, not far at all. I didn't move. I was hoping, maybe even praying, that it was a deer. But I'd camped enough to know how deer move. They don't snap branches in short, deliberate steps like that. They don't stop moving for long pauses and then go again. Whatever this was, it had weight to it. I stayed in the tent for what felt like an hour. I didn't even unzip the flap to look. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. I knew if someone really wanted to come into the tent, it wouldn't take much. But I figured maybe, just maybe, they'd go away if they thought I was asleep. The sound eventually faded, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just laid there, holding the knife, cold, wet, and wide-eyed. The tent walls glowed a dull gray from the overcast sky, and I waited for the sun to rise. When morning came, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Everything was soaked. My boots were wet from where the flap of the tent had leaked, and the tarp had blown halfway down. I stepped outside and looked around slowly, heart still pounding. There were footprints, not animal tracks. I saw the impressions in the mud, not 10 feet from my tent. Someone had walked up from the trees, stood there for a while, then turned and walked back into the woods. I followed them for a few steps until they disappeared into the undergrowth, swallowed by wet ferns and brambles. I felt that cold, panicky twist in my stomach. Not fear exactly, just the realization that someone had been standing right outside my tent in the dark, in the middle of a storm with no flashlight, no reason to be there. I packed my things fast. I didn't eat. I didn't bother folding the tarp or stuffing the sleeping bag properly. I just shoved everything into the pack and took off. I wasn't running, but I was moving quick. The way back to the car felt longer than it had coming in. The trees were darker. The rain never stopped completely, and I kept turning around, certain I was being watched. I never saw anyone, but that feeling, like someone was just out of view, never left me. When I got to the car, I threw the gear into the trunk and locked the doors before I even started the engine. I sat there with the wipers going, staring at the trailhead, wondering if someone was going to step out of the woods. Nothing happened. I pulled out and drove until I hit a town with a gas station. I went inside, bought a coffee I didn't really want, and sat in the parking lot drinking it while trying to calm myself down. I kept looking at the rearview mirror. I didn't stop again until I crossed the state line back into Alabama. That night, I stayed at a friend's house. I didn't tell them the full story, just said I'd cut the trip short because of the weather. I didn't feel like trying to explain that someone had stood outside my tent for no reason. I wasn't sure I could explain it. A few weeks later, I was scrolling through local news and saw a small article, barely a paragraph long, about a missing hiker in that same part of Tennessee. They'd gone out solo like I had, and no one had heard from them. Their car was found parked near a different trailhead, a few miles from where I'd camped. Search teams went out, but they didn't find anything. That's when it hit me. Maybe that person had been out there the same night I was. Maybe those steps I heard had been them. But if it was, why didn't they say anything? Why walk up to a stranger's tent in the middle of the night, in the rain, and just stand there? Or maybe it wasn't them at all. Maybe it was someone else. Someone who liked finding solo campers. Someone who didn't always get caught. I haven't camped alone since. I still think about that night every time it rains hard. I think about the sound of those footsteps, the way the stick snapped, the way those footprints just stood there and then turned back. And I still wonder what would have happened if I'd unzipped the tent, or coughed, or moved too much. But I didn't. I stayed still, and I made it out. Sometimes I think that might be the only reason I'm still here. It was late October 2022 when I finally decided to take a break from everything. The past year had been nothing but grief and noise. My ex-husband, Daniel, passed away in May. Heart attack. We had been separated for 6 years, but I still felt it like a blow to the ribs. We didn't talk much anymore, but we shared something deep in the past, and that doesn't just disappear. We'd met young, made a life, ruined parts of it, and kept moving. Still, when I got the call from his brother, something in me cracked. I didn't cry then. I didn't cry at the memorial, but I cried 2 weeks later while folding laundry. After months of everything spiraling, work, house repairs, my sister calling nonstop to make sure I wasn't drinking too much, I packed my things and drove out to the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. Not exactly glamorous, but it was quiet. No cell signal in some parts. Dense woods, scattered lakes, and nobody to tell you what to do. I'd been there a few times when I was younger, but never alone. This time I wanted to be alone, completely. I chose a stretch near Apple Pie Hill. Not right at the tower where kids partied at night, but deeper down some fire roads where the trees closed in and the brush made it hard to hike in or out unless you knew what you were doing. I parked my car just off the service road, strapped on my gear, and hiked in about 3 miles before setting up camp. The air smelled like pine and wet dirt. It had rained 2 days earlier, so the ground was still soft. I found a patch of high ground with some dry moss, not too close to the edge of the creek that ran maybe 40 yards away. I pitched my tent, set up a small fire ring with rocks, and boiled some water for instant coffee. The first sip felt like breathing for the first time in months. The first day was simple. I hiked around a bit, took a few photos with my old Canon, and collected firewood. I didn't see a single person, just deer prints, rabbit droppings, and a few rustling noises in the underbrush that I figured were squirrels or raccoons. As the sun set, everything turned gold and quiet. I sat by the fire, poking at it with a stick, thinking about how Daniel used to hate camping. He never liked being dirty, and he hated bugs. The one time we tried camping, back in '03, he ended up sleeping in the car with a towel over his head. That night, I slept like a rock. The second day started off just as peaceful. I cooked oatmeal with cinnamon and apple slices I'd brought in a sealed bag. The air was cooler that morning, and I wore a flannel over my shirt. I walked further out that day, following the creek upstream. I found an old fire pit near a fallen tree and a rusted metal cooler half buried in leaves. It looked like someone had camped here years ago and just left it. Inside was a single Budweiser can, faded and dented, and a spoon blackened by fire. I kept walking, moving in slow arcs so I could find my way back by landmarks. That's when I saw the boot. Just one, sticking out from a tangle of brush maybe 20 feet off the creek. Old cracked leather half swallowed by dirt. I approached it slowly, scanning for snakes or anything else. It looked like it had been there a while. There was no leg in it, just the boot, empty. A size 10 or 11, maybe. I stood there for a while, staring at it, wondering if I should report it. But there were no signs of a body or bones or anything else. Probably just someone's lost gear. Back at camp, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not because it scared me, but because of how quiet everything had gotten while I stood there. Like even the birds stopped to look. The silence wasn't normal. It made the hairs on my arms rise. I shook it off, made dinner, and climbed into my tent with a book and a small headlamp. I read for a while before drifting off. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of twigs snapping. Not one or two, but several. like something large was moving just outside the tent. I stayed frozen, my heart pounding in my ears. Could have been a deer, maybe a bear. I hadn't seen signs of bear scat, but it wasn't impossible. I waited, listening. No growls, no snorting, just slow, deliberate steps circling around. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I found footprints, human ones. A pair of them, spaced wide apart like someone had been walking slowly. They went halfway around the tent and then off into the woods toward the creek. I followed them for a few yards before they disappeared into pine needles and leaf litter. I packed up my food tighter that day and tied it high in a tree. I kept my knife closer. I started carrying the small hatchet I'd brought just in case. I tried to tell myself it was just another hiker who got lost and stumbled through. But nobody should have been that deep in without a pack or gear. And they sure as hell shouldn't be circling someone's tent in the middle of the night. On the third night, I built a larger fire and didn't let it go out. I stayed awake until well past 1 a.m., staring into the flames, listening. The woods felt different, too still. Every now and then, a twig would snap in the distance, and I'd grip the hatchet a little tighter. I remembered how Daniel once joked that if I ever ran off into the woods, he'd never come looking. He said I was too stubborn to die, even out here. That thought stuck in my head longer than it should have. Sometime near dawn, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time slower. They came from the same direction. I stood up and held my breath. I didn't call out, didn't want to give my position away more than the fire already did. I stayed completely still. The footsteps stopped maybe 15 feet from where I was standing. Then nothing, not a sound. Whoever it was stood there in silence, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Eventually, I sat back down, axe across my lap. I stared at the trees until the sky started to lighten behind them. When the sun came up, I walked to the spot where the sound had stopped. There were prints again, deeper this time, like the person had stood in place for a while. No signs of a camp nearby, no trash, no tarp, just footsteps in and footsteps out. I made coffee with shaking hands. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of my camp, widening it by about 100 yards. I found more old boot prints near a cluster of brambles. 2 sets this time. One looked like the same deep tread I'd seen before. The other was lighter, smaller, like a woman's or a teenager's. I packed my tent tighter that night, laid my sleeping bag inside but didn't plan to sleep. I sat with my back to a tree, axe in hand, fire blazing. Every snap of wood, every whisper of wind, I jolted like a live wire. Sometime around midnight, I heard movement again, but this time it wasn't circling. It was pacing, back and forth maybe 20 feet beyond the fire, like they were waiting, watching. I didn't move, didn't run. I stayed perfectly still, watching the dark. And then it stopped. Nothing else happened that night. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have, because I woke up stiff and sore. The fire burned low. I made a decision right then. I was leaving. I packed everything as fast as I could, skipping breakfast, ignoring my usual cleanup routine. I strapped my gear and started walking out, retracing my GPS points and trail markers I'd scratched into trees on the way in. About 2 miles in, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Pile of rocks, neatly stacked, about the height of my waist, right off the trail under a dead tree. It hadn't been there on the way in. On top was something small and metal. I walked closer and realized it was a wedding ring, men's size, plain silver band, exactly like the one Daniel used to wear. I almost dropped everything and ran. My mind raced. Couldn't be his. It made no sense. He was cremated. The ring was never recovered, but it looked just like his. The same scratches along the side, the same dull gleam. Picked it up, hands shaking. Inside the band were initials. DTKM 1998. My initials. His initials. The year we got married. I didn't remember walking the rest of the way out. Just trees, roots, and silence. When I reached the car, I threw everything in the back seat and drove without stopping until I saw other people. I didn't tell anyone. Not at first. Not for months. When I finally spoke about it to my therapist, she said grief does strange things, that maybe I left the ring there as some subconscious ritual. But I didn't. I know I didn't. Sometimes, late at night, I'll dream I'm back in those woods, that someone's still walking out there, watching, waiting, but I never went back. I keep the ring in a drawer now, wrapped in an old bandana Daniel used to carry in his pocket when he worked on his truck. I don't wear it. I don't touch it, but I know it's there, and I know I'm not going camping again. Not alone. Not ever. I had just turned 32 in early September of 2019 when I decided to head out for a solo camping trip with my dog, Moose. I live in northern Idaho, so I'm used to woods, trails, and long, quiet weekends. Moose is a big shepherd mix, all black, a rescue from 2 years earlier. He's the best dog I've ever had, calm, alert, loyal, never runs off, never makes a scene. That weekend, I had no big plans, and I wanted to get away from the noise of town. I'd been stressed out with work and figured I'd go someplace new, just a bit farther out than my usual spots. I picked a trail I hadn't hiked before, Bitterroot Backline Trail, not far from the Montana border. It was listed on a few forums as lightly trafficked and good for dogs. That's all I needed to see. I packed up my bag, loaded my sleeping gear and food, and hit the road early Saturday morning. The drive was long, about 3.5 hours from my house. The trailhead was just a tiny clearing with a faded wooden sign. I didn't see another car when I pulled in, and that was part of the appeal. We started hiking around 11 a.m. The air was crisp and dry, and the trees were turning yellow and orange. The trail wasn't very maintained. Some logs were down, and the path thinned out in parts. I liked that. Moose stayed close to my side, sniffing and scanning like he always did. We passed a few small streams and climbed slowly uphill for about 5 miles until I found a flat spot with a good overlook. There wasn't much wind, and I could hear water trickling below somewhere. I set up camp there, hung my food bag, set up the tent, got Moose's blanket out, and just sat. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that rings in your ears after a while. I could hear the distant sound of birds and bugs. I didn't see any other hikers the whole afternoon. That didn't bother me. I've camped alone plenty of times. I've always preferred it. Around 6 p.m., I made some simple food on my little camp stove and fed Moose. He lay by the edge of camp, resting but alert. That night, I sat and watched the sky change. The sun dropped behind the ridge, and the air cooled fast. I crawled into my tent with Moose beside me, zipped up, and passed out early. No phone service, no light but the moon and stars. I woke up around 3 a.m. to Moose growling. Not barking, not pacing, just a deep, steady growl from his chest. My eyes opened fast. I didn't move. I just listened. The forest outside was dead silent. No breeze, no bugs, not even an owl. Moose was up now, standing, hackles raised, staring at the tent door. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. I reached for the small knife I always keep near me when I camp. I waited. I thought maybe it was a bear, but Moose didn't act like it was a bear. He wasn't scared, he was angry. I unzipped the corner of the tent just a little, enough to peek out. Nothing, just trees. I stayed still for 10 more minutes. Nothing moved. Then Moose stopped growling, lay back down, but stayed tense, head up, watching. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I checked around camp. No tracks, no signs of anything. Maybe it was a deer, maybe it was nothing, but Moose doesn't growl at nothing. I had planned to stay 2 nights, but I started thinking maybe we'd hike a little farther today and find a new spot. Something about this one felt wrong. I packed up, ate a quick breakfast, and we hiked another couple miles. The trail dropped into a small valley with a narrow river running through it. I followed a faint side trail that curved away from the main path along the river. The ground was soft here, damp, but quiet. I walked another 20 minutes and found a small clearing near the water. It looked like someone had camped here before. Old fire ring, a few logs pulled into a square. I set up again. By mid-afternoon, I was feeling better. Moose was relaxed again, and the river made steady noise. I fished a little, didn't catch anything, just killed time. I cooked again around 6 and sat by the fire until dark. This time, I stayed up later, watching the shadows move across the trees. I didn't want another 3 a.m. scare. When I finally crawled into the tent, I left the rain fly off so I could see the sky. Moose curled up close. I think we both drifted off around 10. Then I heard something. Not Moose this time. A sound outside the tent around 1 a.m. It was soft, like something stepping on twigs, moving slowly. Not crashing through like a deer, not small like a squirrel. Steady, deliberate. My eyes opened and I froze. Moose was already up again. Not growling this time, just staring toward the noise. It moved in a half circle around the camp. I could barely hear it, but it was there. I didn't move. I held my breath, listening. Then it stopped. For a while, nothing. Then again, the same steps, now from behind. Closer. I sat up and pulled my knife out again. Moose stood, tail stiff, ears forward. Then it stopped again. Dead quiet. This went on for what felt like an hour. Something circling, waiting. Moose didn't bark, but he didn't lie down either. Around 3 a.m., it all stopped. No more steps, no movement, just silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun came up, I got out fast and checked the area. There were tracks this time. Human boots. Not hiking boots, work boots, square-toed, deep tread. They came from the woods on the north side, circled our tent twice, then vanished into the brush on the east. No sign of another camp. No gear. Just tracks. I felt sick. I packed up in 20 minutes. I didn't eat. I didn't even let Moose off the leash. We hiked out fast back to the main trail, back toward the car. We didn't stop. I kept checking behind us every 100 feet. Nothing. By noon, we made it back to the trailhead. My car was the only one there, but next to the trailhead sign, stuck into the dirt, was a crushed beer can. I hadn't seen that when I parked. It was right in the middle of the clearing, like it had been placed there. I opened the car, Moose jumped in, and we left. I didn't report anything. Who would I report it to? A guy walking around the woods at night? It's not illegal. Creepy, sure, but I hadn't seen him. I didn't know what he looked like. There was no real evidence of anything, just tracks. Still, I didn't go camping again for a long time after that. Weeks passed. I kept thinking about it. What was he doing out there? Why did he circle my tent? Why didn't he come closer? Did he think I was asleep? Did he see Moose? What bothered me the most wasn't what happened. It's what could have happened. If Moose wasn't with me, would I have heard the steps? Would the guy have gotten closer? Into my tent? I don't know. I don't want to know. I'm back to hiking now, but I don't stay out overnight anymore. Not alone. I stick to well-traveled trails. I bring more gear, more lights, and I always bring Moose. He saved me that night, I'm sure of it. Or at least scared off someone who was up to no good. The woods are quiet, but they're not empty. Not all danger comes from bears or weather. Sometimes it wears boots and waits in the dark. And sometimes the only thing between you and that danger is a dog who doesn't sleep when something's wrong. Back in the summer of 2019, I was 32 and had just finished a string of long, exhausting work projects. I was a freelance field technician at the time, bouncing from site to site for contracts, mostly setting up remote equipment in the outdoors. After almost 10 months without a real break, I finally had a 2-week window to myself. I didn't want to spend it around people. I wanted quiet, no cell service, no voices, no concrete, just trees, air, and the sound of my boots hitting dirt. So I packed up my truck, loaded my camping gear, and drove down to Southern Oregon. I didn't pick a fancy site or a well-known trail. I looked at the map, found a chunk of forest west of Klamath Falls that wasn't on any mainstream camping blogs, and decided to go there. It was state-managed land, legal for dispersed camping, and that was all I needed. I drove for hours along winding roads that turned into gravel, and then dirt, and finally nothing but 2 tire tracks cut through grass and pine needles. I parked my truck in a natural clearing about 6 miles from where the closest Forest Service road ended. I saw no other cars, no trash, no fire rings. It felt untouched. I set up camp on the edge of a small rise that overlooked a dense stretch of firs and cedars. It wasn't flat, but I liked that. The slope gave me a bit of view, and it was dry and soft underfoot. I pitched my tent, unpacked my cooler, stowed my gear in a bear-safe container, and spent the rest of the day wandering a few miles in each direction to get familiar with the terrain. The woods there felt different than other forests I'd worked in. Quieter. Not peaceful, just quiet in a way that made you notice it. I didn't hear any planes overhead. No wind through the trees. Barely any bird calls. Just the occasional creak of a trunk or snapping of a branch. But no obvious wildlife. The first night went fine. I slept light as usual. I always do the first night outdoors. My body takes time to adjust. I heard a few twigs snap somewhere in the dark around 2 a.m., but it wasn't close. I figured it was a deer or a raccoon. The second day was just me walking around, eating snacks, reading, and taking pictures. I made a fire, cooked some canned chili, and watched the sky go from orange to black. That night, around 11 p.m., I stepped out of my tent to pee and saw a small patch of ground about 20 feet away that looked different. I don't know how else to describe it. The dirt was packed tighter. It looked grayer. It was a perfect rectangle, maybe 3 feet by 4 feet, tucked between 2 young pine trees. I didn't notice it the day before, even though I must have walked past it several times. At first, I thought it was an old tent spot. Maybe someone camped there years ago and the ground never recovered. But something about it didn't sit right. It was too squared off, too level, and the soil looked freshly turned, even though there weren't any shovel marks. I walked over, crouched, and touched the dirt. It was softer than the surrounding ground, not wet, but looser. I poked at it with a stick. There was resistance a few inches down, like I hit something flat. I tapped around more and kept feeling the same thing. It wasn't rock. It felt like wood, old wood. I stood there a long time just holding the stick, looking at that patch. My chest felt tight and I didn't know why. Eventually, I walked back to the fire and sat down. I didn't sleep that night. I zipped my tent shut and lay there with my knife in my hand, listening for anything. The forest was dead silent again. By morning, I convinced myself I was being dramatic. It was probably a piece of plywood or something someone buried as a prank. Or maybe an old cache. People sometimes bury supplies out here and forget about them. I made breakfast, packed my gear for a hike, and set off in the opposite direction of the weird patch. I was gone for 5 hours, bushwhacking and checking out some low ridges about 4 miles away. When I got back to camp, the first thing I did was look at that spot again. It looked exactly the same, but the stick I'd left near it was gone. Not broken, not moved slightly, just gone. I searched the area, thinking maybe I misplaced it or kicked it without noticing. Nothing. That patch of dirt looked untouched otherwise. I told myself an animal might have dragged the stick away, but I couldn't let it go. I walked in circles around that patch for 10 minutes, looking for signs of tracks. I didn't find any. That night, I stayed up by the fire with my headlamp on. I didn't drink. I didn't cook. I just sat there with my knife and my hatchet, staring into the trees. Around 1 a.m., I heard something move through the brush downslope. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like footsteps, slow and careful. I killed my headlamp and crouched near the fire pit. I couldn't see anything at first, just darkness. Then, after maybe 30 seconds, I saw the shape of a person, just a silhouette, moving between the trees about 30 yards away. No flashlight, no visible gear, just someone walking uphill, moving between the trunks. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The person stopped behind a tree and stood there. I stayed like that for maybe 15 minutes. Eventually, they moved again, away from my camp, deeper into the woods. When I couldn't hear them anymore, I went into my tent, grabbed my heavier flashlight, and scanned the entire area. Nothing. No prints. No sounds. No signs of anyone passing through. I didn't sleep. I didn't even sit down again. At first light, I packed everything in 20 minutes. Tent, gear, cooler, food. All of it crammed into the bed of my truck. But before I left, I did something stupid. I walked over to that patch one last time and started digging with my camp shovel. The soil came up easy, too easy, just like I thought there was wood underneath. I cleared a 2-foot section and saw the top of a plywood box. Old, weathered, held together with rusted nails. My hands were shaking. I didn't want to keep going, but I had to. I pried at the corner until a piece broke away. The smell hit me first, faint but wrong, like rot and mildew mixed with metal. I opened it enough to see inside. There were bones, not animal bones. Human, small, maybe a teenager, wrapped in a tarp. Duct tape around the ribs, a cracked shoe near the bottom. I backed away and threw up. I don't remember how I got to my truck. I just remember driving faster than I ever have down that dirt path, bouncing over rocks, scraping past branches, not stopping until I hit pavement. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station, reported everything, and gave them GPS coordinates. The cops took it over from there. They asked me questions for hours. I told them everything. They said the site matched a missing person case from 2005. A girl named Renee Kramer. She was last seen hiking with someone, but no one could prove who. They never found a body until now. They said I did the right thing, but I couldn't shake the image. That square patch of dirt, the silhouette in the woods, the stick that went missing. I still go camping, not as often and never alone. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that spot. I wonder who buried her. I wonder if they ever came back to check. I wonder if they saw me digging. I keep telling myself I was just lucky that night. But deep down, I think someone watched me find her and chose not to stop me. I wasn't new to camping, but I had never gone alone before this trip. It was the end of August 2019, and I had just turned 34 a few weeks earlier. I needed space to think. I was working in Denver, long hours at a digital marketing firm, and everything in my life had started to feel like noise. That year had been hard. My girlfriend had moved out in February. My uncle passed in April, and I was spending more time in the office than at home. I was burned out, and I didn't like the person I was becoming. So I told my manager I needed 5 days off and headed northwest into Wyoming. I didn't want to go to a national park. I didn't want other people around. I just wanted quiet. I looked at a map and picked a stretch of BLM land near a place called Ten Sleep, up by the Bighorn Mountains. I had no connection to it, no reason for choosing it. It just looked remote. The kind of place where you could sit beside a fire, not speak for days, and let your head settle. The drive took about 8 hours, and I spent the night in a cheap motel just outside Buffalo, Wyoming. The next morning, I loaded up with supplies: water, dry food, propane, some firewood, extra batteries, and drove about an hour and a half into the foothills, bouncing over dirt roads until I was deep enough in that I didn't see another car for over an hour. I parked in a small clearing with a wide view of the basin below and started setting up camp. Tent, cook stove, cooler, the works. I had my .357 revolver in a hard case in the back of the truck. I always brought it when camping, mostly because of animals, but also just because it made me feel better being alone. The first day was peaceful. That evening, I sat in a camp chair and watched the sun drop below the distant ridges, sipping from a metal mug of whiskey. No signal on my phone, no buzzing, no notifications, no pressure to respond. It was exactly what I needed. I fell asleep listening to the breeze shift through the pine trees. The second day, I hiked a couple miles up the ridge behind my camp. The land was beautiful. Golden grass, rocky outcroppings, thick tree cover here and there. I saw a few mule deer, a couple of hawks riding thermals above the canyon. The ground was dry and dusty, and the air had that sharp, dry smell of high-altitude sagebrush. I came across a rusted fence post at one point, bent and half-buried, but it wasn't connected to anything. Maybe it marked a property line once, long ago. I walked until my legs were tired, then circled back and spent the afternoon reading in the sun. That night, I built a fire and cooked a small meal, beans, a couple of hot dogs. It was dead quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the chirping of insects. I must have fallen asleep around 10. I remember waking up once, maybe around 1 a.m., because I thought I heard something move outside the tent. But when I unzipped the flap and looked out, I didn't see anything. Could have been a raccoon. I wasn't nervous. Not yet. It was the third day that things started feeling off. I had planned to explore a little farther out from camp. I packed a small bag, snacks, water, my handgun, a compass, and my GPS unit, and started hiking northwest. The terrain got steeper the farther I went. About an hour in, I found an old dirt path that cut along the side of a narrow hill. It didn't look like a game trail. It was too flat, too even, and there were faint tire tracks almost gone with time. Maybe an old fire road. I followed the path until I came to a rusted-out pickup truck. It was sun-bleached and looked like it had been sitting there for years. All 4 tires were gone. The doors were missing, too, and there was nothing in the bed. I poked around it for a few minutes, then kept going, curious now. Not long after, I found what looked like the remains of a small cabin or maybe a hunting shack. Just a few weather-beaten boards, a broken stove tipped on its side, and part of a wall still standing. It looked like it had burned a long time ago. The metal roofing was curled and blackened. No animals around. No birds chirping either. There was a weird feeling standing there, like whoever lived there just vanished. I didn't stay long. Something about it made my skin itch. I turned around and started heading back. That's when I noticed the first thing that truly bothered me. When I looked down at the trail, I saw fresh footprints. Not mine. Someone had walked over mine while I was up at the shack. The boot prints were bigger than mine and deeper, like whoever made them was heavier or carrying something. I stopped walking and listened. Nothing, just the wind. I looked around and didn't see anyone. The terrain sloped down hard on the left, and the trees were thick on the right. I didn't like the feeling in my gut. I turned and started walking faster. I didn't run. I didn't want to make noise, but I picked up the pace and kept glancing back over my shoulder. When I got back to camp, everything was just how I left it. Nothing moved, nothing missing. Still, I couldn't shake that feeling. I kept telling myself it could have been an old print I hadn't noticed, or maybe a hiker just passing through. But something about the way they were over mine didn't sit right. That night, I kept the fire going later than usual. I listened harder than I usually did. The woods around me felt wrong. I didn't even go inside the tent until close to midnight, and when I did, I kept the revolver tucked into my sleeping bag. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up every hour or so, hearing little snaps or crunches outside. Might have just been small animals, but I couldn't relax. Around 4 a.m., I heard what sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps near the edge of camp. Not fast, not running, just moving. I didn't move. I just laid there and waited, holding my breath. After a while, it stopped. I didn't get out to check. When the sun finally came up, I opened the tent slowly and looked around. Nothing seemed touched, but I saw 2 prints near the fire ring. Not mine. They were pointed toward the tent. I packed my bag fast. I wanted out. I threw everything in the truck haphazardly and didn't care about organizing it. I just wanted to get back to a paved road. I had to drive down a bumpy dirt road for almost an hour before I'd get signal. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to step out of the trees. And then, about 20 minutes after I left camp, I noticed something in the mirror, a flash of something moving behind me. I stopped the truck, heart pounding. I rolled down the window and listened. Silence. I got out and looked back down the road. Nothing. But when I walked a few yards back toward where I had just driven from, I saw fresh tire tracks on top of mine. Another vehicle had come down the road behind me, but I never saw it. I jumped back in the truck and didn't stop again until I was back on asphalt. My hands didn't stop shaking for hours. I checked into a cheap motel in Buffalo again and spent the rest of the day sitting on the bed, not sure what to do with myself. I didn't call anyone. I didn't tell anyone. What would I even say? I went back home the next day, went back to work. Life continued. But here's the thing, about 3 weeks later, I got a call from a ranger with the BLM. He said they found my name in a logbook I had signed at a ranger station just outside the area. Standard procedure, apparently, if someone camps on public land for more than 3 days. He asked me if I'd seen anyone else up there. I said no. He told me they'd found another man's abandoned campsite less than 3 miles from mine. No ID, but the site looked lived in. There were cans of food, a sleeping bag, a camp stove. They'd also found a small pair of binoculars, a notebook with writing, and some disposable cameras. One of the rangers had the film developed. Most of the pictures were of deer, birds, landscapes, but 3 of them showed my campsite from a distance. At night, one of them was taken from behind a tree, aimed right at my tent. They never found the guy. I don't camp alone anymore. I don't go anywhere without telling someone exactly where I'm going. I still don't know who was out there or why he was watching me, but I know I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there, following, watching, waiting, and I'll never go back. I was 31 when I decided to take some time off work and get away from everything. It was late summer in 2017. I'd been working in a small-town hardware store in Indiana, living in the same routine for years. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, repeat. My job wasn't bad, but it felt like I was just wasting time. Like every week was bleeding into the next, and I wasn't really doing anything that mattered. I didn't have a family of my own. No girlfriend at the time. Just me and a 1-bedroom apartment above the store. I remembered camping with my dad when I was a kid. Back then, we'd drive a few hours out into the countryside, set up a tent in some open field or edge of the woods, and just sit by the fire until the stars came out. No phones, no noise, just quiet, bugs, firewood, and sky. I missed that. I missed the silence. So I decided I'd go out alone. I took a few days off, packed my gear, and started looking for a place that wasn't crowded or part of some big national park. There was this area I found online, Benton County, Indiana, not too far from the Illinois border. Lots of farmland and countryside, barely any towns. There was this tiny road called County Road 750W that led deep into open fields and sparse woods. A guy on a camping forum said he stayed out there once, off the road in a tree line by a dry creek bed. No trails, no markers, no traffic. Just flat land, cornfields, and patches of forest. It sounded perfect. I left on a Thursday morning, took my car down Route 41, and cut west through a few back roads until I reached 750W. It was all cracked pavement and gravel. You'd miss it if you blinked. The road stretched on between farms with no houses in sight. I drove a few miles until the fields gave way to a stretch of trees and thick brush. I pulled off on the side and parked my car behind some bushes, out of view. There weren't any signs saying I couldn't camp. It was private land, maybe, but it wasn't fenced or posted. Besides, I wasn't planning on causing any trouble. I loaded my pack, strapped on my gear, and started walking down a slope off the road where the tree line thickened. The land dipped into a shallow depression with dry weeds and cracked mud. Must have been a creek a long time ago. I followed the bed for about a half mile until I reached a small open clearing tucked between trees. It was perfect. You couldn't see the road, and if someone drove by, they wouldn't see you. No sounds except insects and the wind. I set up my tent at the edge of the clearing and started gathering wood for a fire. I took my time, stretching out the work, sweating in the late afternoon sun. I had a machete strapped to my leg and a small hatchet for kindling. The woods weren't too thick, so I could move around without worrying about losing sight of camp. I cleared a fire pit and stacked some dry sticks and logs, then cracked open a can of beans and heated it up. As the sun dropped behind the trees, everything slowed down. The wind got cooler. Crickets came out. The sky turned soft orange, then purple, then black. I had no cell signal, which I was expecting. I left my phone in my bag and just sat by the fire, eating slowly, watching sparks float up into the dark. Felt good. That first night, I didn't sleep well. Not because of anything strange, just the usual stuff. New place, tent. Every little noise felt louder. Every snapping twig sounded closer than it was. But I eventually dozed off and woke up around 7 the next morning with the sun shining through the nylon. My body was stiff from the thin sleeping pad, but I felt better. I made instant coffee, stretched, and went for a walk through the woods behind my camp. That's when I found something that made me feel uneasy. About 200 yards from my tent, the trees opened up into another clearing. But this one wasn't natural. It had tire tracks leading into it, deep, fresh ones like someone had driven in just recently. The ground was dry, but the tread marks were clean. It didn't make sense. There weren't any roads nearby, and even an ATV would have a hard time getting through those trees. At the far end of the clearing, I saw an old trailer. Not a camper, more like the kind you'd hitch behind a truck to haul stuff. It was rusty and dented, sitting on flat tires. There were plastic bags stuffed inside and some broken tools scattered around it. A bent shovel, a smashed plastic crate, some torn tarp. It looked abandoned, but not old abandoned. It had the look of something someone still used from time to time. I didn't touch anything. I just looked around, noted it in my head, and slowly walked back to my camp. That afternoon I tried to relax, but I couldn't stop thinking about the trailer. I kept telling myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe a farmer stored junk out here. Maybe someone came through hunting a few weeks back. But I couldn't shake the feeling. That night, I kept my hatchet closer. I didn't sleep much, not because of noise this time, but because I kept expecting to hear something. Footsteps, voices, a car. Nothing ever came, but my nerves were all twisted up. The third day, things got worse. It was a little after noon, and I had just come back from refilling my water bottles at a small pond I found further west. When I stepped into the clearing, I stopped cold. Something was off. My gear had been moved, not stolen, just shifted. My sleeping bag was turned sideways. My pack had been opened, unzipped halfway, and then left on its side. One of the food wrappers I'd buried was out of the hole and lying near the fire pit. My water bottle had been knocked over. It was like someone had gone through my stuff and then walked off. I looked around the trees, listening, holding still. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything. I crouched and checked the dirt. No clear footprints, but the ground was soft enough in spots that you could tell something or someone had walked through recently. I wanted to leave, but I told myself to calm down. Could have been a raccoon, could have been a fox, could have been wind, even. I was jumpy, already on edge from that trailer and the fact that I was alone. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. I packed everything tightly that night. I even set up a small line of sticks around the tent, just enough that I'd hear if something stepped through them. I didn't light a fire. I ate cold jerky and bread and stayed inside the tent once it got dark. Sometime after midnight, I heard something. It wasn't close, but it was real. It sounded like metal, a soft clang, like something bumped against metal, maybe 100 yards out toward the direction of the trailer. I didn't move. I just lay there, breathing slowly, listening. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then silence. I stayed awake until the sky started to get light. I packed up that morning, quickly. I didn't eat. I didn't even drink water. I just took down the tent, shoved everything in my pack, and started moving. I didn't go back the way I came. I didn't want to walk past the trailer. I decided to cut through the woods and loop around back to the road. The land was uneven, full of dry brush and thorny undergrowth. Took longer than I expected. I kept checking behind me, turning at every sound, sweating despite the cool morning air. After maybe an hour and a half, I reached the edge of a cornfield. I figured if I followed it long enough east, I'd hit the road eventually. I walked fast, keeping low. The field was tall enough that I couldn't see much ahead, just rows and rows of green stalks. Then I found the deer. It was dead, fresh, lying in a patch of dirt between the corn and tree line. The stomach had been torn open, not clean like a hunter's shot, ripped, guts exposed, flies buzzing, blood still wet. Its eyes were still glassy, not yet dulled by death. What scared me wasn't just the deer. It was the fact that someone had clearly dragged it there. You could see the trail, flattened grass, streaks of blood, like it had been pulled by the legs. And the direction it came from? The same direction I had camped. I didn't wait. I took off, practically running, not even looking at my map. I followed the edge of the field, trying to stay hidden but moving fast. I didn't stop until I saw the road. I came out through a ditch, covered in burrs and sweat, breathing hard. My car was still there, untouched, hidden behind the bushes where I'd left it. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped my keys twice before I got it started. I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway. Once I was back in town, I went home and dumped all my gear in the shower. I stood there, letting the water run over my arms, trying to make sense of what happened. I never went to the police. What would I say? That I found a trailer in the woods and a dead deer? That someone might have walked through my camp? There was no proof, no crime, just bad vibes and guesswork. I kept thinking about how far out that place was, how quiet, how empty. If someone had wanted to do something to me out there, no one would have heard a thing. I didn't sleep for 2 days after I got back. I sold my camping gear online a week later. It's been years now, and I still don't know what really happened out there.